So this is going to be a super quick introduction because I didn't get as far on this cabinet this week as I thought I was going to. I'm working on this cabinet and another cabinet for a whole different customer at the same time, kind of bouncing between the two, and I spent more time on the other cabinet this week. But anyway, this is the cabinet, the same one I showed last week. It is obviously upside down. I don't believe I had this cut out last week. That's the decorative element on the bottom. But where I left off in the last video, I just made this outer skin that wraps around the inside of that plywood cabinet. So you can kind of see now how those inset panels will hit the plywood, but look inset around the frame of the cabinet. So it technically has a face frame, but not really, because the face frame sits flush with the plywood. It's not really wider than the plywood. So this right now has 2 coats of oil-based primer on it. And I believe in the upcoming video I'm going to show you how I made the drawers for this, and I'll see how much further I get, but I think I have enough material to make at least 2 more videos, because this will also get painted and this also has to get a glaze put on top of it. I still don't really know where to find that glaze yet, so that will be fun. So that might not make it into the video, but it will get painted on top. To start, I'm going to attach all those facade door panels I made, and my method for attaching them is going to be splines. So on that back panel on both of the edges, I'm cutting a 1/4 inch dado right down the center, or a 1/4 inch groove right down the center. I'll do that on both sides of the back panel, and then the side panels, I put a mark where that groove will line up where the side panels meet up, and then I cut another groove on their edges so I could add a spline into this on both pieces. So you can see kind of like an angle that's a little further away. This is cutting that groove on the side panel. And then to attach these, I'm just going to be using some 1/4 inch plywood I had laying around. You can kind of see how that groove lines up. So this is the 1/4 inch plywood. I'm cutting some splines. It's not long enough to go through the whole piece, so I'll add a little piece and then add a little scrap piece at the end. I usually round over the edges just a little bit. This is they're usually a nice tight fit in that groove, even though this is 1/4 inch plywood and that's a 1/4 inch groove. I'm just going to put a liberal amount of glue in there. I can hammer that spline in. And you can see it goes in smooth enough. You don't want to be beating the heck out of it, but a nice tight fit is ideal in a situation like this. Add a bunch more glue, and then I could plop it in place. That one side's already glued in, so that spline fits right into that back panel. And the plywood carcass is actually behind this right now, so I know that it's fitting nicely, and then I can let this set up. So now that it's in place, you can see I'm taking a little piece of that plywood and I'm going to just cut a little bit off of it and put it in there so that that spline goes all the way from the top to the bottom. Once it's dry, I'll cut off the excess because it was a little bit long. So in order to add the face frame to this cabinet, I decided to cut little open-ended mortises out of the cabinet. You can attach these with pocket hole screws, but since I didn't show it, but this facade is already screwed to the plywood, I wanted something really structural. So I just followed the marks of the plywood down and I just chiseled out these little notches so I would have something to attach the poplar frame to. So you can see now the plywood sits further back than the poplar, and that's how the doors will be inset. They'll be flush with the frame of the poplar but hit on the plywood carcass. So this is that poplar. I'm just ripping it down into 3/4 inch strips, fitting it into my little pieces. That was just a test fit to make sure they're going to work with the measurement I have set with my fence. I could cut a bunch of these, and then once I have some long lengths, I could just trim them to size with a handsaw, plop them in there, and that is what that face frame is going to look like. So I didn't glue these up just yet. I didn't glue them up till a little bit later because they were stiff enough that I didn't have to. Just kind of measured to make sure all my openings were the same. So the bottom, there's no toe kick on this. She didn't want a toe kick. So the bottom is just going to be another piece of plywood, and I'll cut a decorative element out of that before the cabinet is done. So next was to start building all of my drawer boxes. So I rough cut all of my plywood down. This cabinet, the total is about 36 inches wide, so these are a little bit smaller than that. It was a weird depth because it has to go underneath an island, so I couldn't get the larger drawer slides. These are 15-inch drawer slides, so they're going to be 15-inch boxes. And the height, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, is about 7 inches a door. So once I had my rough pieces cut, I did a test run on my dovetail jig, and then I'm going to cut dovetails in the front two sides of all of my panels. It's not ideal to do this out of plywood because I don't love seeing the plywood edge on here, but the dovetails make for a really rigid drawer box, and if you have one of these jigs and you have it set up, the repeatability of it is so easy. I could go through and cut all of these really quickly, and like I said, it makes a really strong box, and the plywood itself is pretty strong. Now I'm using 3/4 inch plywood because I don't like to have to buy multiple sheets for a project. I was able to make all of this out of one sheet of 3/4 inch maple veneer ply, and because with this jig I think the smallest it will cut is 5/8 of an inch, and it's really hard to find 5/8 of an inch without special ordering it around by me, so I just do 3/4 of an inch, and it's a little oversized for some applications, but these drawers are actually fairly large, so I was happy to use 3/4 with that. Anything around 36 inches wide, I think something a little thicker is ideal. So once I have all of my pieces cut, I'm putting a 1/2 inch groove on the bottom, a 1/2 inch up from the bottom. For these bloom undermount slides, I subtract about an inch. You don't have to subtract as much as an inch, but I usually subtract about an inch from the opening to make sure I have enough clearance, and the bottom clearance has to be a 1/2 of an inch. Now, I had 1/2 inch plywood laying around, which is why I chose 1/2 inch bottoms, but that is a little bit on the thick side. I could have gotten rid of away with 1/4 of an inch, but like I said, I don't like to have to buy sheet goods if I don't have to. So making it 1/2 inch isn't going to hurt the drawer. So that is why I use that. And then on the back side of all of my pieces, because the backer is also 1/2 inch, because I ran out of 3/4 inch plywood, I cut a 1/2 inch rabbet on the back side of my panel drawers. And this is rough cutting the bottoms for putting everything together. So then I could just put some glue on these and start putting everything together. So like I said, the measurements I originally cut are based on the opening of my cabinet. I've thought of doing a video for these bloom undermount slides, but the instruction manual for them is like 6 pages long. The video to show all the different ways you could use these slides would be really long. So and I'd have to make multiple style cabinets to be able to make a comprehensive video. So if you want to use these, the learning curve is a little bit more intense than the side mounted slides, but once you figure it out, I love these. I feel like they're very forgiving if your drawer box isn't square and your face frame isn't square, and the mechanism itself is just very smooth. So once I have the sides in place, I could cut that bottom. It's just a matter of trimming off the side a little bit. I can check for square, measure my back opening, and then all of these measurements will be the same on the other 2 drawers, and I could pre-cut them, and then I could add that backer with a little bit of glue. Like I said, the backer is 1/2 inch. Now, they tell you in the instructions to notch out the back, but what I do is I just don't have the back go all the way to the bottom of the drawer, so I avoid having to notch out the back to account for the locking mechanism in the back of the bloom undermount slides. It's the way I usually make drawers anyway, so it's not a big deal, and it saves some time of having to notch out a piece. I check for square on these because these will set up by themselves without clamps with the dovetails. If it's not square, you just kind of whack it with a hammer in the direction that you need it to be longer or shorter, and then check for square again, and then I'll start sinking some brads into it so it won't move around on me. And once it's perfectly square, I completely put brads through that back panel, and once this glue dries, this will be a super sturdy drawer. And even after I flip it over, I check for square again, because sometimes moving them even a little bit will throw them out of square. To attach the locking mechanism on the bottom of the drawer, you can buy a jig, but I just use the tip of a countersinking bit, pre-drill a little tiny hole, and then attach the mounts. And there's also a mounting jig for figuring out where to put the hole in the back of the drawer, but what I like to do is just put them in place, tap them with a hammer, it marks where it needs to be, I drill that hole, and it aligns perfectly, putting it into the cabinet. And that, I think, is like a 5-30 seconds, something around there for that back hole. All their instructions are in millimeters, so you kind of have to change everything over if you're using fractions. So then to attach these, on the bottom it was easy because I could just let them sit flat, but on the sides it's nice, I could screw right into the sides, but I use a level just to make sure that they're level, and they're sitting on top of the slats in the front. They weren't long enough to fit the slats in the back, otherwise that would have been really easy to do. And then once those sides are screwed into place, I could test the drawers, and like I said, these work almost perfectly first time around. There's not a lot of changes, and you could see they're inset in the cabinet because I'm going to be putting a facer on the front of them. You could also see how high they're elevated off of the bottom. That's that 1/2 inch clearance you need for the bottom. So once those are in place and working, I'm going to go through and finally glue my face frame in place. As I glue this in place, I'm making sure that they're equidistant apart and everything is parallel. So when I go to make the inset cabinets, everything aligns really nicely. Inset cabinets, in my opinion, and drawer fronts that are inset are the hardest to make. It's the biggest learning curve, because if they're off even a little bit, your eye picks up on the reveal being off, and it can sometimes be a really big eyesore. So once that was done, I could go through and put some edge banding on the top edge of the drawer boxes to cover that plywood. The edge banding is pretty self-explanatory. I have a nicer iron that's I got from my grandpa, so I could go through and you just melt this stuff into place, and I go around and do the whole perimeter. I don't film a ton of edge banding. It's boring to do, and I think it's boring to watch. So once that is done, I have rough cuts of all of my fronts, and I have 2 sides edge banded already. You can see that's one side and the other side are edge banded, and then I put it in place. I make a mark to get about a 1/16 inch reveal, and then I can trim it down to those marks. The edge banding will add a little bit onto this, but I kind of account for just a little increment of thickness that will be added. So once I make those marks, I just add the edge banding to the other 2 sides of the drawer front. So then this is putting it on the top. I like to put on the top last so that the sides are covered. It's just a matter of rolling this out, cutting it to size, and ironing it into place, and then trimming it. It's pretty straightforward, but can sometimes be a really tedious process if you have a lot to do. So then to get my reveal, I'm using playing cards. These little stacks of playing cards are about a 1/16 of an inch, so I could just put them in place and get the perfect reveal around all sides. Now sometimes I use double-sided tape and tape these into place, but for this I just kind of climbed up top, and you can't really tell, but I have a countersinking bit inside the cabinet, and I'm countersinking a hole and putting 2 screws in, and then I could pop the cabinet out and add more screws. Now before this is all said and done, I'll glue these fronts to the boxes, and I'll be able to realign it with the screw holes, but since the cabinet's going to be painted and the inside isn't, I'm going to pop the fronts off in order to make painting easier, so I'm not going to glue them yet. So like I said, once I have it off, I can countersink those holes, and then I'm adding a little electrical tape tag for the poles, because the poles haven't been decided yet, and I could pop these back into place. And now if your reveals are off, you can make tiny incremental adjustments with those bloom slides, which is the other nice thing about them. And I usually have to make minor adjustments, but I don't do that till the very end. I get it good enough and then move on. So this is how everything fits. And in the next video, you can see it on there, I'm going to put some detailing on the front of the cabinet. So in the next video, you'll see making the detailing and adding that to the cabinet, as well as adding wheels to the bottom, cutting out that decorative element on the bottom as well, and then priming and painting.